Some weapons from the ancient world looked like they had no place in history. Blades forged with metals Europe wouldn't discover for nearly 1,000 years. Siege machines engineered with a precision we usually associate with firearms. And a kind of fire so relentless that it could burn across the sea, like a medieval flamethrower no modern lab can fully replicate. These weren't myths, they were real, carried into battle by warriors who lived thousands of years ago. And they raise a question that still unsettles archaeologists today. How did people with no modern science or industry create weapons that seem as advanced as anything we recognize in our own time? This is Armchair Archaeology, and today we're uncovering ancient weapons that defy history itself. Stay with me until the end, because one discovery revealed mystery structures inside a sword that modern science didn't even recognize until the 20th century. If discoveries like these light up your curiosity, join our little expedition party by subscribing. It helps more history-minded folks find these stories, and it tells me to keep digging.
When archaeologists unearthed Viking swords etched with the name Ulfberht, they knew immediately these were not ordinary weapons. Dating from the 9th to 11th centuries, the blades outclassed anything Europe was producing at the time. While most swords were prone to chipping or snapping in combat, Ulfberhts could flex and spring back into shape, making them both deadlier and more reliable. The secret was in the steel. Ulfberht swords were forged with a purity so unusual for the Viking Age that they seemed centuries too advanced. To make them, iron had to be heated to extraordinary temperatures and infused with carbon in precise amounts. Europe, according to traditional timelines, did not master that process until nearly 700 years later. So where did it come from? One possibility is trade. The Vikings sailed far beyond the North Sea, raiding, trading, and traveling deep into the rivers of Russia. Those routes connected to the Islamic world, where crucible steel had already been perfected in Persia and India. Perhaps the blades, or at least the raw ingots, traveled along those networks into Scandinavia. Yet the sheer number of Ulfberhts found suggests something more than a few imported pieces. Some scholars argue that northern blacksmiths may have learned enough of the method to craft their own versions. If true, that knowledge vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The skill was never passed down widely, leaving only the swords themselves as evidence. So did the Vikings master space-age metallurgy? Or were they borrowing secrets carried along the Silk Road? To hold an Ulfberht was to hold an almost supernatural advantage. Against opponents armed with brittle iron, these blades cut through armor and weapons with terrifying ease. Modern comparisons call them the closest thing the Viking Age had to a lightsaber. Sleek, powerful, and seemingly out of place in their own time.
In the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire revealed a weapon so terrifying that it reshaped naval warfare for generations: Greek fire. Unlike flaming arrows or burning tar, this strange liquid clung to ships, sails, and skin. Even on water, it kept burning, turning the sea itself into a battlefield. To the enemies of Byzantium, it must have seemed like sorcery. Delivery made it even worse. Imperial warships were armed with bronze siphons that blasted jets of fire at approaching fleets. Some were cast in the form of dragons or lions, so that flames seemed to pour from the mouths of beasts. Imagine rowing toward an enemy ship and suddenly seeing arcs of fire roar across the waves. Chroniclers describe sailors flinging themselves into the sea to escape, only to find the water itself aflame. Buckets of sand, vinegar, even old wool were thrown in desperation. But nothing stopped it for long. Greek fire was more than a weapon. It was a secret of state, entrusted to a select group of imperial chemists whose identities were often kept hidden. Recipes were guarded so closely that not even Byzantium's allies ever learned the formula. Writers speculated about naphtha, resin, sulfur, even quicklime. But none of the mixtures we know today match the descriptions of a flame that could not be extinguished with water. The psychological impact was immense. Entire fleets were broken not only by the fire itself, but by the fear it inspired. In a world where naval battles decided the fate of empires, Greek fire gave Byzantium an edge that kept it alive against impossible odds. Even today, modern chemists cannot reproduce it with certainty. To its enemies, it was a nightmare made real, a medieval flamethrower that seemed impossible to resist. Speaking of guarded formulas, I've been sipping today's notes from our Ancient Secrets mug, Armchair Archaeology Edition. It's a little nod to all those lost recipes and workshop whispers we'll never fully recover. If you'd like one of your own, you'll find it waiting in our shop. The link's just below the video.
For centuries, Damascus steel swords were wrapped in legend. Medieval accounts describe blades sharp enough to slice a silk scarf drifting through the air, yet strong enough to cut through European weapons without breaking. To knights facing them in battle, they seem to possess a life of their own, holding an edge that ordinary steel could never match. The beauty of these blades added to their reputation. Across their surface, they shimmered with rippling patterns like flowing water or swirling smoke. These were not decorations, but the natural result of the forging process, as layers of iron and carbon-rich steel fused together under the smith's hammer. Each weapon bore its own unique pattern, and the sight of one in the hand of an enemy must have been as intimidating as its cutting power. To knights in mail, it was like facing a weapon from another world. European blacksmiths tried relentlessly to copy them, but the secret always slipped away. Many scholars now believe the process began with Indian Wootz steel, traded into Persia and Syria, where craftsmen developed their own methods. For centuries, workshops in the Middle East produced these legendary swords, while in Europe, their reputation only grew. By the 18th century, however, the tradition had vanished, and no one has ever fully recreated the original method. Modern analysis of surviving blades reveals that their internal structure was unlike other steels of the time. The smiths may not have understood the science behind what they were creating, but their technique produced unusual properties that modern metallurgists still debate today. Tradition, intuition, and generations of practice had given them results far beyond what their age should have allowed. To hold a Damascus sword was to carry a weapon that seemed to merge art and science. It was both a symbol of prestige and a reminder that some of history's greatest technologies have been lost to time. When farmers uncovered the Terracotta Army in 1974, they found more than rows of clay soldiers. Buried alongside them was a vast arsenal, bronze swords, spears, halberds, and hundreds of crossbow mechanisms. These weapons had been sealed underground for over 2,000 years, yet many emerged astonishingly well preserved, with blades still sharp and fittings still gleaming. The crossbows revealed something remarkable. Their bronze trigger mechanisms were so carefully cast that parts from one weapon could fit another. That kind of interchangeability is the basis of modern assembly lines, yet here it appeared in the 3rd century BCE. The Qin dynasty was not just arming its soldiers, it was mass-producing standardized weapons on a scale that rivaled later industrial systems. Even more surprising was the state of the blades themselves. After centuries in damp soil, they showed little rust. At first, archaeologists thought the dry climate had preserved them, but chemical analysis revealed traces of chromium on their surfaces. To archaeologists, it looked like rust-proofing centuries before stainless steel, though many now think the chromium traces came from lacquer or soil chemistry. The explanation is still debated. Some argue the chromium came from lacquer that once coated the statues, seeping onto the weapons over time. Others suggest it may have been deliberate, the result of metallurgical experimentation. Whatever the cause, the outcome is extraordinary. Thousands of weapons that survived in fighting condition long after their owners had vanished. To picture the Chen armies equipped with this arsenal is to understand their dominance. While rivals carried crude iron or poorly maintained gear, the first emperor's legions marched with durable, standardized weapons that gave them confidence and control. Their empire was built not just on numbers, but on technology that seemed centuries ahead of its time. If that level of ancient precision just made your eyebrows levitate, you can help power more deep dives with a super thanks. It's like dropping a copper ingot into the research furnace, small boosts that keep these investigations sharp. When Spanish conquistadors first met the armies of the Aztec Empire, they expected warriors with simple wooden clubs and stone-tipped spears. Instead, they ran into the Macuahuitl, a weapon that stunned them with its brutality. At first glance, it looked like a broad wooden sword, but its edges were set with blades of obsidian, a volcanic glass that can be sharper than a modern surgeon's scalpel. In combat, the Macuahuitl combined the crushing force of a club with the slicing edge of a sword. Spanish accounts describe armor ripped apart and limbs severed with single blows. They also watched shields shredded and helmets dented open in seconds. One chronicler even claimed he saw a horse decapitated in a single strike. Exaggeration or not, it terrified Europeans who had never imagined such lethality from stone. Obsidian has limits. It can fracture under heavy impact. Set into grooves along a wooden core, however, hundreds of razor edges work together to deliver devastating cuts. A Macuahuitl could maim, disable, or kill with frightening efficiency. And unlike European swords that were optimized for thrusting, this weapon fit Aztec warfare. Capturing enemies for ritual sacrifice often mattered more than killing them outright, so wide cutting edges that could incapacitate were ideal on the battlefield and in ceremony. To the conquistadors, who trusted in steel blades and cavalry charges, obsidian-edged swords that tore through armor felt almost unfair. To the Aztecs, the weapon embodied ingenuity and control over local materials. Even today, experimental archaeologists who build replicas are surprised by how cleanly they cut meat and bone. The Macuahuitl remains a reminder that advanced technology does not always require steel or gunpowder. Sometimes it means perfecting the resources at hand until they rival the deadliest arms of the Old World.
Centuries before the word Damascus became synonymous with legendary blades, its origins were being shaped in southern India. As early as the first millennium BCE, Indian smiths had mastered the creation of Wootz steel, a high-carbon metal that would travel along trade routes and become the foundation of some of the world's most prized swords. The process was unlike anything in Europe at the time. Iron ore and carbon-rich materials were sealed inside small crucibles and heated until they fused into ingots. When worked by a skilled smith, these ingots produced steel that was both hard enough to keep a razor-sharp edge and flexible enough to withstand heavy use. Roman writers praised Indian steel as superior to anything their empire could produce. By the medieval period, merchants were carrying it across thousands of miles into Persia and the Islamic world, where it became the raw material for Damascus blades. What made Wootz remarkable was not just its performance, but the tradition behind it. Generations of smiths passed their knowledge orally, guarding the technique within families and guilds. The recipes could vary by region, shaped by the local plants and ores that went into the crucibles. Yet the results were consistently extraordinary, giving rise to blades that stayed sharp through repeated blows and resisted the brittleness that plagued ordinary iron. By the 19th century, colonial upheaval and the rise of industrial steelmaking disrupted the old methods. The fragile chain of transmission broke, and the ancient process largely vanished. Today, metallurgists still study surviving examples, fascinated by their unusual properties. To wield a weapon of Wootz steel was to hold more than just a blade. It was to carry the distilled knowledge of centuries, a technology that belonged to India long before the rest of the world caught up.
Among the many innovations of ancient China, one of the most ingenious was also one of the most practical, the repeating crossbow. Known as the zhuganu, it allowed a soldier to unleash a steady stream of bolts with a single motion. By pulling a lever back and forth, the bowstring was drawn while a fresh bolt dropped into place from a magazine mounted on top. With this rhythm repeated, even an ordinary defender could fire faster than trained archers. It was the ancient world's closest thing to a semi-automatic. Each individual shot was weak compared to a longbow or heavy crossbow. It could rarely pierce armor and lacked the range of larger weapons. But effectiveness came from numbers rather than power. A wall of defenders could release volleys in seconds, filling the air with projectiles that disrupted charges and slowed attackers. Even glancing wounds added to the chaos, making formations break apart before they reached the gates. Chinese tradition associates the weapon with the strategist Zhuge Liang of the 3rd century CE, though simpler versions may have been in use earlier. Over time, it became common not only on battlefields, but also in households. Families kept repeating crossbows ready to ward off raiders, and in these settings, the bolts were often tipped with poison. A single scratch could become fatal, giving the weapon a reputation that extended far beyond its raw power. The design itself feels startlingly familiar. One mechanical motion produced shot after shot, the same principle that drives semi-automatic weapons today. More than 1,000 years before gunpowder revolutionized warfare, Chinese craftsmen had already created a weapon that applied the same logic. On battlefields dominated by single-shot bows and hand-to-hand combat, the repeating crossbow offered something different. It gave ordinary defenders the ability to hold their ground and introduced a concept of rapid fire that the rest of the world would not adopt until the modern age. The Roman legions were famous for their discipline and engineering, but one of their deadliest tools is often overlooked: the Scorpio. At first sight, it resembled an oversized crossbow, yet it was in fact a torsion-powered artillery piece that could pick off enemies at remarkable distances. The Scorpio worked by storing energy in bundles of twisted rope or sinew. When the arms were drawn back, the tension built until the release sent a bolt flying at tremendous speed. Ancient accounts claim the missiles could pierce both shields and armor, and reconstructions suggest they could travel hundreds of meters. For the soldiers marching in formation, it meant advancing under the cover of hidden sharpshooters. For enemies on the receiving end, it meant comrades collapsing before they could even reach the line. Unlike massive siege engines that hurled stones in great arcs, the Scorpio delivered accuracy. Operators could aim at individuals on ramparts or target cavalry riders long before they closed the gap. Each machine was light enough to transport with the army and small enough to be operated by a single soldier. In large numbers, they created zones of fire that made approaching a Roman position nearly impossible. Fragments and reconstructions showed just how refined their mechanisms were. The torsion frames, the release triggers, even the bolts themselves reveal precision more often associated with firearms than with ancient war machines. Rome's enemies often expected brute force, but instead they found themselves facing weapons that could strike with uncanny precision. The Scorpio gave the Roman army more than range. It gave them psychological dominance. On the battlefield, it was not only the legionary with his shield and sword that had to be feared, but also the unseen machine waiting to strike from afar. I'm curious, in a head-to-head at 100 meters, which would you least want aimed at you? The repeating crossbow or the Roman Scorpio? Tell me why in the comments. I love seeing your battlefield logic. Well before the first gunpowder volleys thundered across battlefields, another weapon was already reshaping warfare: the composite bow. Developed among steppe nomads during the Bronze Age, it looked small and unassuming compared to long hunting bows. Yet by layering wood, horn, and sinew,
craftsmen created a weapon that stored immense energy. A short bow could launch an arrow with the force of one much larger, powerful enough to pierce armor. This innovation changed the balance of power across Eurasia. Scythians, Huns, and later Mongols built their reputations on mounted archery, using composite bows to dominate open plains. Swift cavalry could strike, retreat, and strike again before infantry could close the distance. Ancient writers describe entire armies worn down by endless volleys, harassed to exhaustion, and picked apart long before a decisive clash. Constructing these bows required patience and expertise. Each layer was glued under tension and left to cure for months or even years. The finished weapon was strong, yet sensitive to moisture, which meant steppe warriors cared for their bows as carefully as their horses. The knowledge of how to craft them passed through generations of specialized artisans, making each bow a product of both culture and science. In some ways, it's the same logic as today's military gear. Smaller, lighter, but just as lethal. The brilliance of the design was in its portability. A weapon small enough to fire from horseback could strike with the force of a massive warbow. That combination of speed and firepower gave nomads an almost unbeatable edge against larger, slower armies. Modern archers who handle replicas are struck by how familiar the experience feels. Compact, yet powerful, the composite bow foreshadows the engineering logic behind modern military weapons. Lighter, smaller tools that still deliver devastating impact. Long before cannons or rifles, it was already rewriting the rules of warfare. Among the Celts of Iron Age Europe, swords were more than weapons. They were symbols of status, carried into battle as marks of identity, and often buried or offered to rivers as sacred gifts. Some of the most striking are the so-called Anthropoid swords, named for the human figures sculpted into their hilts. These handles curve into stylized shoulders and torsos, with some even showing heads or faces, so that the warrior gripped not just a weapon, but a figure shaped like a person. Why create such designs? Archaeologists suggest they may have represented protective ancestors or guardian spirits. Others argue they embodied the warrior himself, binding his identity into the blade he carried. When raised in combat, the sword became an extension of the fighter's own body, blurring the line between man and weapon. These swords were not mere ritual pieces. Many show signs of wear, nicks, and blade damage, evidence that they were swung in real combat. Yet their role was also symbolic. Celts often cast swords into rivers after battle, or buried them with their owners. A hilt shaped like a human figure carried powerful meaning in those moments, turning the act into more than just disposal. It was a sacrifice, a way of giving both warrior and weapon back to the other world. To modernize, these swords feel almost uncanny. Unlike the clean lines of Greek and Roman weapons, Celtic anthropoid hilts look as though the blades themselves were alive, imbued with human presence. They could easily be mistaken for props from a fantasy film or video game. For the Celts, however, they were companions in both life and death, reminders that war was not only a matter of steel, but of spirit. Across centuries and continents, these weapons reveal something surprising. Time and again, ancient warriors carried arms that seemed to belong to another age. Obsidian blades sharper than scalpels, crossbows that fired like semi-automatic rifles, fire that burned across the sea. History is filled with technologies that shouldn't have been possible. And now the fun fact we promised at the start. When scientists examined certain ancient blades under powerful microscopes, they discovered structures inside the metal that modern science did not even recognize until the 20th century. Some contained nanoscale carbon structures that modern science only began to recognize in the 20th century. The blacksmiths who made them had no idea of atoms or molecular lattices, yet through tradition and craft, they created materials that modern researchers are still trying to fully understand. It is a reminder that history is not a straight line of progress. Knowledge can appear suddenly, centuries before its time, and then vanish without explanation. Which of these lost breakthroughs would you want to see rediscovered today? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing which mysteries spark your imagination. And if you enjoyed this journey, remember to like the video, subscribe to Armchair Archaeology, and ring the bell so you never miss the next discovery. Until next time, stay sharp, keep questioning, and remember, the past is often armed with secrets far more advanced than we expect.